Most properties that sell in Melbourne are scheduled for auctions, minus apartments. So, what are auctions? Welcome back to another Own It podcast. My name's Dion, and I'm here to help educate you on the home buying process. In today's episode, we'll be discussing auctions and what they are. And in later episodes, we can discuss auction strategies and how to bid at auctions successfully. But I think it's really important, firstly, we unpack what auctions are. This is also the second time I've filmed these podcasts. So the first 4 episodes were all in one batch. So I already feel more confident. I'm not as nervous. So they'll only get better from here. One thing I would really appreciate is if you could leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever you listen on. That massively helps us out. So what are auctions? Well, essentially, it's an opportunity for a vendor to sell their home publicly to buyers. And whoever holds the highest bid either has the first right to negotiate with the vendor or successfully buys the auction. Now, auctions aren't necessarily just exclusive to real estate. Like there's plenty of auctions for like even eBay, right? eBay's an auction. It's a format that allows buyers to bid where they see value in a property, and whoever sees the most amount of value successfully purchases that item. And that's no different to real estate as well. Whoever holds the highest bid either gets to negotiate with the vendor or gets to buy the home. If you have been in the marketplace for a couple of weeks looking to buy a property, I'm sure you've stumbled across an auction. If you haven't, I would highly recommend going to a couple before you even considered bidding at an auction yourself. It's really important you understand the process and how things happen. And to be honest, they're quite fun to watch. Like it's a performance. There's a lot of potential sellers there as well that are considering selling their property. They want to see what their neighbor's house sells for so they can work out what theirs is worth. So the real estate agents know this. They put on a big spectacle. There's coffee vans sometimes. It's quite enjoyable if you have 30 minutes extra on your day of opens to go watch one. I would highly recommend it. So why are auctions so popular in Melbourne? And it's not just exclusive to Melbourne too, by the way. Major cities like Sydney and others also have heavy auction cultures. There's many benefits for all parties when buying at auction or selling an auction right. So for the vendor, the seller of the property, they get to have a live demonstration of what their property's worth. Like whoever holds the highest bid sees the most amount of value in it, and they'll say, this is what I'm prepared to pay. Obviously, no one else is prepared to pay more. Otherwise, they would have. So from a vendor's perspective, it's a great environment for them to see what their property's worth. For a real estate agent as well, facilitating an auction, it shows the vendor that you're getting the most amount of money for them possible. And as well, for a real estate agent and a vendor, it's quite an emotional process for buyers. They get quite competitive, and because it's transparent, they can physically see other bidders participating and paying more than they're prepared to pay, and this can often encourage them. They also tend to stretch their budgets compared to a private sale where they're not in an environment where it's so controlled, where they make logical, educated decisions. When you're out on the street, you think with emotion. When you're bidding for properties, you don't want to miss out, you get competitive, and you pay more than what you would have probably set your budget at previously. And for buyers, the benefit for you is that you can actually see transparently that there are other buyers out there that do exist, that do see value in the property. And sometimes that gives you as a buyer more confidence to know you're paying what the property's worth. Ultimately, a property is only worth what someone's willing to pay. So seeing someone else prepared to pay $1,000 less than you should give you more confidence. That's what the property's worth. There's also not many other processes as a buyer that you can beat a competitor by $100 or $500 or $1,000. I'm not necessarily saying you should only bid in $1,000 increments, but with an auction process, you actually have that opportunity to bid in $1,000 increments if you wanted to. Do not buy at auction. I hear so many people say this, and it's one of the biggest myths in real estate. This is just my opinion, right? But with auction campaigns, right, a property that goes to an auction, they have a different quote on that property than a property that goes to a private sale. They have a different quote because at an auction, to sell for the best price, you have to generate competitive bidding and you have to generate momentum. So if you started a little bit lower, you give yourself a runway to generate that interest to maximize the result. The problem is people see what a property's quoted and they think that's what a property's worth. So a property that's going to auction quoted 900 to 990 and it sells for 1.1. It was always worth 1.1. Just the quote was 9 to 990. So people then look at that and go, oh, it sold for more than it was worth. No, it didn't. The quote was just different. So it's really important to understand that auctions and private sales only sell for what properties are worth. That doesn't necessarily mean people won't get emotional at an auction and potentially pay more than they would at a private sale. I think that can sometimes occur, but it's important to not completely rule out all auctions because you're trying to avoid overpaying for properties for 10, 20%. Okay. Quotes and values are two different things. Now, depending where you are in Australia, there's different regulations with auctions. Okay. So I used to be an auctioneer when I was a real estate agent, and I would call auctions in Victoria. Now, in Victoria, anyone can bid at any point at an auction. You don't have to register, right? You can literally rock up. And I remember when I was a real estate agent, I wasn't calling the auction, but we were selling a property in the eastern suburbs. This buyer rocks up mid-auction, had never seen the property before, hops out, walks up to me. I was working the crowd, trying to get bids from buyers. And he says, where's the bid at? I told him, and he literally put his hand up and bid. You do not need to register to buy property in Victoria, but that doesn't necessarily mean in all the other states you don't have to, because I know in Sydney you have to register to bid. So it's just important to understand the legislation in your local marketplace to know that you're not doing something wrong. So how does a typical auction run, right, on the day? So they'll have a 30-minute open for inspection beforehand. It's your last chance to kind of go through. But there's also an obligation for them to let you know the rules and legislation as well about the auction. So they're required to do that, but it's a good chance for you as a buyer to quickly do some last minute checks if you need to. Then they'll run the auction. It's about, I'd say, 5 to 10 minutes of reading through the rules that they have to conduct the auction, or how they have to conduct the auction, I should say. And then they will discuss the property description. I know everyone knows what the property is that they're bidding on, but often this is just to loosen the crowd up a little bit. Most bidders are really nervous, so just giving them a chance to settle is really important. And then they'll ask for bids. And then from there, sometimes these auctions can drag out, and I've seen auctions drag out for an hour sometimes. Sometimes they'll be over within 5 minutes. It just depends. Normally the auctions that drag out for an hour, people are bidding in really small increments. I often think those auctions will sell for more than someone that would have bid in firmer, stronger increments. But we can discuss strategies that you might use in a couple episodes later. For now, it's just important to understand the basic concept. Something about auctions that differs to private sales, and we'll chat about private sales in the next episode. With auctions, you are buying an unconditional contract. So what that means is there's no 3-day cooling off period. You don't have any terms to your contract. And we haven't spoken about terms on this podcast yet, but when you make an offer, you can go subject to a building pest, you could go subject to finance, and we can discuss those a little bit more in the next episode as well. You have to be completely unconditional. So what that means is when they say selling, sold, and you buy the property and you sign that contract, that deal is done. You are obligated to fulfill that contract. There is no getting out of that contract unless you want to lose your deposit. So it's really important coming up to an auction that you do all your due diligence and all your preparation beforehand. And it's also, by the way, not just the auction day itself that is unconditional. It's 3 clear business days before and 3 clear business days after the auction that are also unconditional. So even if you make an offer after the auction, you still might be under auction terms. So just be really careful that you are prepared if you are making an offer after. It's not a private sale. Now, there's many different outcomes with an auction as well. Obviously, we all know that an auction can sell to the highest bidder, but it's important to know what happens when it doesn't sell to the highest bidder. What if no one bids at that auction? What is a reserve price, and when does a vendor set a reserve price? I think a lot of buyers has a misconception that think the vendors will set the reserve price right at the start. And when I was an agent, buyers would always ask me, what's the reserve price going to be? Agents do not know the reserve price, or 9 out of 10 times, you know what, I'd even go as far to say 99% of the time, a real estate agent will not know the reserve price until 30 minutes before they conduct the auction, when they have a meeting with their client and they set it and sign it on their authority. A reserve price is the vendor giving permission to the real estate agent to sell that property if it meets that reserve or more. And this is also commonly referred to when conducting an auction as we're on the market. So you hear buyers say, are we on the market? That means, has the property met the reserve price? Now, if you're facilitating an auction, a reserve has been set. So that's when you can ask, what's the vendor's reserve? Are we on the market? But beforehand, the reality is a reserve hasn't been set. So if a property does not meet its reserve price, what happens? Does it still sell, or it doesn't? If it doesn't meet the reserve price, it's not on the market. It's not available for sale technically. So they pass the property in. When a property passes in, it essentially means that the auction is, I wouldn't say failed, but is over, and now it transitions into a more private sale method. Now, as I said before, there's 3 clear business days after and before where there's no 3-day cooling off period. So it's not completely a private sale process, but they're open then to taking offers. And normally they'll set a single asking price at the reserve, if not a little bit more than the reserve price. So they've got a bit of room to negotiate. So if you've ever seen a property scheduled for an auction, you haven't attended it, and then you still see it's available with a single asking price of, let's say, $1.1 million, it's safe to assume that the reserve price could have been anywhere between $1,050,000 to 1.1. What happens if a property passes in, so it doesn't meet the reserve price, and there's an active bidder that's holding the highest bid? This is where they have the exclusive right, and this is what the auctioneer will say. That buyer has the exclusive right to negotiate with our vendors one-on-one at their reserve price. So the auctioneer is pretty much saying that buyer has the first chance to chat to our owner at the price they've told us that they're prepared to sell at. That's what you're bidding for essentially until a property goes on the market. That's the best way to look at it. Until a property meets the reserve price, you're bidding for the right to have a chat with the vendors to negotiate at the reserve price. Once the property meets the reserve and it is on the market, then you're bidding for the right to purchase the property. So what do you need to be careful of if you're heading to an auction? First of all, I would say have a really clear budget if you're considering buying it, and do not go over that budget. As soon as you break your budget once, you will always break your budget. The biggest problem people have with setting a budget is they set it at a price they would like to pay. The reality is auctions often sell for prices people don't want to pay, but they still end up paying. You are better off having a harder chat and a more honest chat with yourself before you head to that auction and set your budget at your absolute limit, not the price you'd like to pay. Because if you then need to have conversations during the auction, it looks like you're approaching the end of your budget and it shows weakness in your position. Another thing that's also really important to do before the auction is have your terms agreed upon. So if you're bidding on a certain settlement, if you need a certain deposit structure, you need to have that agreed before the auction. Because if you don't, you have to facilitate what the auctioneer called for. Now, if you've had your contract reviewed from a conveyancer before the auction, which, by the way, I would highly recommend, they may indicate to you that there's certain clauses that they would like changed if you're successful. It is your responsibility as a buyer to have this agreed before the auction from the vendor or the vendor's representative. Have them agree that, yep, they're prepared to change those or amend those clauses to the contract if you're successful. If you don't, you are required to sign the contract that you bid on. So it's really important to do your due diligence beforehand and make sure you've cleared up everything. Dion, what if I'm not buying at auction? Well, in the next episode, we'll discuss private sales, all the different methods, and understanding the process as well, so you're more equipped to buy a property. Stay tuned.